This week on Cloud S.L.A.W, I'm going to make permission boundaries easy. Well, easier. Of all our labs, this is the one that's going to make you look smarter than all the other so called cloud security experts at work. Don't say that out loud, HR might get upset. Today, we're going to learn about permission boundaries, which are a legitimately advanced identity and access management topic. When I mentioned this lab to a friend with over a decade's experience in AWS security, he said, "Oh, good. Maybe now I'll understand them." I wrote up the topic a while ago, and you can read about that on the post for this lab. And since then, I figured out a pretty easy way, I hope, to explain what they are and why you might need them, which is the part that confuses a lot of people. It turns out I actually designed these labs to back us into a bit of a corner where we need to use a permission boundary to properly defend ourselves. A simple definition for a permission boundary is that it's a guardrail. It's like an organization policy, a service control policy, in that it doesn't grant any new permissions, but it can add restrictions on the total permissions that some identity might have, no matter what other policies are assigned. We mostly use these to allow someone to administer some of identity and access management without allowing them to abuse that to give themselves more permissions, what we call privilege escalation. Basically, a permission boundary says this is the most you are ever allowed to do, even if someone lets you or tries to let you do more. It's just a different kind of a guardrail. And again, it doesn't give you any permission to do anything. That's why I like talking about service control policies. Those do the same thing for an entire account, and a permission boundary can apply that to a specific IAM entity. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why don't we just put that into the regular policies associated with that identity? There's a lot of reasons for it, but the most common one is that we will use permission boundaries because we do need people with some administrative levels of access, and it's a way to make sure, again, that they can't escalate their own privileges. So we can allow them to administer IAM itself and create new users and groups and roles and write policies. And then we use a permission boundary to make sure that they can't change their own roles or change their own permissions or policies. Another reason we might use them is that a user role can be assigned multiple policies. If we don't use like a lot of deny policies or things along those lines, it can be easy to make a mistake and grant somebody too many privileges. But again, from a practical standpoint, the way that I mostly see these being used is to restrict an IAM administrator. Let's go to the whiteboard and see how that works. So if we think about the way policies work overall, the total permissions of what you are allowed to do. So we have kind of three different main kinds of policies here, and I'm going to skip one of them, which is resource policies. So we have our service control policies. And again, this is only applying to identities. That's an important distinction here. We have our service control policies. We have our regular identity. I'm just going to call them IAM policies. And then we have our permission boundaries. And the only thing you are allowed to do is when all three of those things line up. Now, if you think about it, IAM policies are we can allow or we can deny, but generally we use this to give somebody permissions. Well, what if we want to give somebody the permissions to, say, write their own policy, but we don't want them, or to write policies, but we don't want them to be able to assign that policy to themselves? That's where we'd use a permission boundary. Service control policy isn't necessarily going to help you with that because the service control policy will apply to the entire account, but we're really only focused on one particular identity. Oh, I already wrote identity. No reason to write it again. All right. So that's the use case for these. We almost always use these when we want to allow someone to administer some IAM, but we don't want to allow them to increase their own permissions. There can be used for other things, and Amazon's got some great examples in their documentation. Those are a bit more advanced, and I don't really see those use cases very often. Now for our labs, I set us up with a really simple use case, which is the most common one. And it's what I just described as I kind of did my horrific diagram there. This is what I've used permission boundaries for myself. So in IAM Identity Center, we already created an Identity Center administrator group, and we assign those permissions to write and assign policies to different permission sets. But this means that that manager, that IAM administrator, could assign themselves full administrator permissions. So, like, why do we even bother only limiting them to IAM permissions if they could just add the administrator access policy to themselves and they can do absolutely everything? We're going to defend against this with a permission boundary. And that permission boundary is going to stop them from changing their own policies. They could even assign out administrator policies to somebody else, but we're going to prevent them from assigning themselves the administrator policy or any other policy. So there is a bit of a hole here. They can still add themselves to another group like the administrators group. And this is a bit of a problem because it's a limitation of how Identity Center works. So there's a couple of ways that you can handle this. The most common option is that in a real enterprise, you'd probably be using something like Okta or Microsoft's Entra ID as your single sign-on, and you could have different administrators for your identity provider and different administrators for Identity Center within AWS. And that means that the Identity Center administrator can't ever add themselves to a group or even create new users. And the users or the administrators of that other identity solution can't change their permissions within IAM Identity Center for AWS. So that's one way of dealing with that. And one thing to keep in mind is that there's Identity Center uses unique email addresses for all users. So we can audit those, make sure there's not like weird email addresses in there. Now, the reason that this is a problem, and I'm going to go into it a little bit more, but there's no way we can restrict. We can't put resource limitations on users and groups using Identity Center because they're like different users and groups than other IAM users and groups within AWS. It's mind-boggling to me that Amazon doesn't support this. And again, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go through the lab and we get into that point. Last thing is as we go into the lab, I'm going to explain more and go through the details of the setup we have in more detail than I normally do. That's because I know there are going to be some people coming to this lab because they want to learn more about permission boundaries, but they haven't been doing all of our other labs. So I'm just going to show them the setup so they can kind of read this and understand this. So I want to simplify out with a few key points. Permission boundaries limit the maximum scope of things that an identity can do. We apply permission boundaries to IAM users, groups, and roles. That also works within IAM Identity Center, where we put a permission boundary onto a permission set. Permission boundaries do not give any permissions. You're going to see an allow all statement in the one that we write. That just wouldn't allow anything. It just means that it's not going to block anything. So there's actually a fun tip. The first time I went to use permission boundaries, nothing worked because I didn't realize if you don't all IAM policies are default deny. And that means if you just the act of creating a permission boundary will deny anything that's not explicitly allowed just by its literal existence on that identity. So if you don't have that allow all, you'll end up blocking everything. I like to use permission boundaries in a deny mode where I deny specific actions instead of using it to do allow actions to scope. And that's the more advanced and conceptual parts of it. It's going to make sense once I show you what the policy looks like. And remember, the most common use case for a permission boundary is to allow someone to administer IAM, but prevent that identity from giving themselves more permissions. To be blunt, that's the only way that I have ever used it. And that tends to be what I see out there when I've looked at permission boundaries as implemented in other organizations. All right, a lot of talking. Let's jump into the lab. Okay, I want to do a little bit of setup just to remind everybody where we are in terms of what we have. And then I'll walk through what we are going to actually do in this lab, kind of as an overview, because I don't want anyone to get lost. Look, maybe I'm making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be, but permission boundaries are something that does tend to confuse people a bit. So here's our setup. I'm going to go over to the whiteboard. And we have let me get that mouse cursor out of the way. So we have a couple of things in our environment, and this is all within IAM Identity Center. You know what? Let's just say SSO, because that's what I like to call it, because that's what it used to be called. And we have one user, and that user is in a bunch of groups, but one of those groups is IAM administrators. And I'm just going to do my shortcut writing because, yeah. So even though you are that user and you're in multiple groups, one of them is called IAM administrators. That IAM administrator has a permission set that we call Identity Center Administration. So ID Center Admin. The names are a little bit different. That's just what I'm using because it is a pain if I write the whole thing out. Now, remember that a permission set is basically a folder for policies, and there's two policies that we have attached in this particular case. So one of them is that SSO, it's an AWS managed policy, member admin. And the other one is the one that we created as part of our IAM, our Identity Center Challenge, and that I called mine Manage Policies for Identity Center. And that's the one that allowed you. So this one here allows you to do most of the SSO things, but you couldn't write or assign policies. And this one here allowed you to create and modify and work with policies. So that's that core of what we have for our setup. Now, your name may be different because we did this as an IAM Identity Center challenge and you wrote your own policy. That's okay. That's not going to be a problem as we get through the lab. Now, as a reminder, anybody in the IAM administrators group, so this group here that I just circled, could write and assign themselves a policy with any other permissions that they want. There's no restrictions because they could add, say, admin access to their permission set. And that's the problem that we want to go ahead and limit. And that's because they have two permissions lets them do this. One is that they are able to create policies and they are able to assign policies to permission sets. Those are the two things that are allow them to do. So we're going to use a permission boundary to fix this, and here's how. We're going to do all of this logging in as full administrator access. You probably could actually get pretty far in doing this, logged in using our IAM Identity Center Administrator, but at a certain point, I'm pretty sure something would break the moment that permission boundary went in place. We're going to create a new customer managed policy, and let's go ahead and take a look at what that policy is going to look like. So I'll scroll over here, and this is the policy that we've got, and there's two different statements that we have here. The first statement here is our allow all. Now, why do we have that allow all? Well, as I mentioned before, a policy is default deny. And the moment we attach the permission boundary, Amazon doesn't magically say, oh, well, they didn't mean to default deny everything. It will instantly default deny everything. So we have to have that allow all so we don't break anything else. So don't break things. And then we have the one that we actually care the most about. And so the part that matters here is we have deny and any action if we're working with the permission set that is the permission set associated with this identity center administrator. Hopefully I remember to mute that cough when I do the editing. And what this means is they won't be able to read it and they won't be able to add any policies or assign anything to it. So that's what locks them down so that they can't escalate their own privileges. Now, we could allow them to list if we wanted, or we could give them some of the read permission still, and that wouldn't be risky, but I'm going to keep everything very simple right now. They're just not going to be able to look at that or make any changes to it. Now, this will block some other actions, but again, it's only going to block actions using that permission set, and we don't want anybody within that IAM manager group to change that permission set. That's a pretty solid set of restrictions to prevent that privilege escalation. Now, it does leave that hole that we can't fix until Amazon fixes it themselves. The service that holds all of the users and groups when you use Identity Center as your identity provider. It is very different than any other AWS service that I've used because it doesn't allow any resource restrictions and it doesn't really support any conditionals for much of anything. So there's no way for us to say, put a resource restriction in so the administrator can't add themselves to a group. That's normally what I do with the permission set. I can do that in regular IAM. I just can't do that in Identity Center when it's working as the identity provider. So I'm going to submit that one to support. I don't like that. And we'll learn how to monitor for that down the road when we do threat detectors. Okay, so let's go in. Oops, I had a management console open. You want to make sure you log into your AWS Access portal. And within that Access portal, we want to go into IAM as administrator access. Again, you could do this right now. Until that permission boundary is in place, you can create the managed policy that we're talking about and you could assign it to yourself, but then something's going to get blocked at that point in time. And as that gets provisioned, I suspect that would cause a problem. So we'll just go in as full admin. And this is why you're still going to have full admin roles around this, because there's going to be privileged things that you still want to be able to do. You don't want to even trust your sub administrators. The first thing we need to do is we need to create the policy that will work as the permission boundary. Permission boundaries always need to be an AWS managed policy, and actually a customer managed policy, but it always needs to be a managed policy. So we'll go to policies and create policy. I'm going to jump straight into the JSON, and I have pre-written my policy, and this is in the blog post. Don't try to write this by hand, just go to the blog post. So I'm going to copy that out, and then I'm going to select everything here. I'm going to paste it in. And remember, we reviewed this already, and you notice how it's giving us an alert for an allow all? Yeah, because you don't normally want that in a regular policy, but we're using it only as a permission boundary. And then we have our deny action here, which is going to protect against our AWS SSO piece. Now, you're going to need to replace this part right here. So that's the actual ID of that permission set, that PS dash. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to right click on services. Whoops. I'm going to right click on AWS, open link in new tab. This brings me to the portal, and I'm going to go into Identity Center. And I'm going to go into permission sets. And I'm going to click on my Identity Center administration permission set. That ARN that we need is right there. Look at that. It was literally under my mouse. So I'm going to copy that out. And then I go back to creating the policy. Now, this is mine, so I know it's going to work, but we'll go ahead and we're going to paste that one in. So make sure that that is yours, not mine. And the sample policy template I'm going to post, I'll put a reminder in there to paste your ARN here instead of using the one that I preloaded up for myself. Okay, so that's our policy. Scroll down, click next. Policy name, we're going to call it SSO. Whoops, I don't know why that went down there. We're going to call it SSO permission boundary. And then we'll say restricts and IAM identity center administrator from escalating their privileges. Normally I type a little bit better than that. That's all we need to do. So policy name, description, scroll all the way down, click create policy. Okay, so that permission boundary is created. Now we're going to go back into Identity Center. And this time we're just going to do it right from here, services, IAM Identity Center. And we're going to go to permission sets. And we're going to go to Identity Center Administration. So remember, it breaks the policies out. So we have this AWS manage policy, which is for just the core management of AWS SSO. And then we have our allow you to manage policies for Identity Center. And we did that as a customer managed policy. By the way, and that was in the identity challenge. So your name may be different here. And that's okay. It doesn't matter because we're not directly referring to that in any of the other portions of the lab. By the way, you could have done this. Somebody asked as an inline policy. I just chose to do it as a customer managed policy because I might want to reuse those permissions someplace else. Now we're going to go to permission boundaries, not set. Not set means it's allow all. There's no default deny in place. We're going to go ahead and set. Oh, before I do that, almost made a mistake here. I'm going to go to this tab and go to services IAM. And we'll go to our policies. And we will go to customer manage. And I just have to copy that name out. I just didn't remember that name. It's kind of late at night here. So copy that name out, SSO permission boundary, because when I click on permission boundary and I go click set, we're not going to use an AWS managed policy. We're going to go ahead and use a customer managed policy. You notice if I click on all types, it doesn't let me select customer managed. We'll go to customer managed policy and I have to paste in the name. It's really annoying. You don't get to pick it off the list. Don't ask me why. I'm sure there's a reason for it. We paste that name in. Notice it doesn't even seem to do any error checking because I put that and it would still accept it at this point. We'd get an error on the next screen. SSO permission boundary. And then this is the accounts to re-provision automatically. So if you recall, what has happened is in our identity center, in this actual IAM account, is the only place this permission boundary, this permission set has access. But I could have like 50 accounts here, and then I would need to choose if I wanted to not deploy it to all of them. But it's just giving me a notification that it's going to deploy to all of them. So we're going to set the permission boundary. And now it's provisioning that and within this very account where we're operating. Let's go ahead and test it. I'm going to close that tab and then I'm going to deliberately log out. So remember, I'm in as administrator access and I'm going to sign out. And let's close the tab. Now I'm going to go in as Identity Center Administration and go into Identity Center. Everything looks good. No errors. I can go in, do my users and my groups, which is a bit of a problem. I could actually look, okay, who's in that group? That's great. Permission sets. And I can go to, let's go to okay, access denied. So you can see there, I don't even get to see the name because the name is a tag. It's just giving me the identifier. I can go into the administrator access permission set and make my changes here. Now this one was provisioned the management account, so I can't make any changes to that one. I can look at it, I can't make changes. I could go to read-only access, no restrictions. And if I wanted to attach a policy here, I could go ahead and attach any of those policies. It's not going to give me an error. But if I go to view any changes to the permission set here, which is our current permission set, boom, the permission boundary is not allowing me to make any modifications to my current permission set. This is what permission boundaries are great for. I can now, as I'm in this role, I can do all sorts of administrative things, but I can't modify the full administrator access permission set, and I can't modify my own permission set. And I'm restricted on that IAM administrators one. That's exactly what we use these for. I have the ability to be an administrator, but I'm limited from escalating my own privileges from being an administrator of one service to being an administrator of every service. That's my favorite way to use permission boundaries. It's the most common and the most effective use case for them. And like as I said, there is more, but this is enough for our lab today. All right, you're all experts on permission boundaries now. And just as a summary, remember, and I know I keep repeating this, but a permission boundary doesn't give you permissions. It just takes permissions away. It sets the maximum amount of permissions someone can have. And in our case, we said, well, you can do anything and everything, except I'm not going to let you do anything involving this one permission set, which happens to be the one that we have assigned to ourselves. So it's a great way to restrict a service administrator from escalating their privileges to administer other services or to become an administrator of everything. All right. I hope that helps. I hope that made sense. Feel free to drop me a line if not. This one does confuse people, and you can check out the other blog post around it as well. Have a great week.